Very good. So for the fourth part, I think this is something I want to offer to both students and researchers. One way of understanding the theories, and one way of understanding theories in a deep way as well, is not only where they come from, what the framework says, but also how it relates to other theories.
Yes, yes.
So
yes.
I'm very interested in Michael Ullmann's declarative procedural model myself. So,
Yes.
and I noticed that there is no mention of Ullmann's declarative procedural model in your latest book. So, are these two explanatory approaches compatible?
Well, it's actually, Ullmann is basically a neuroscientist, so he talks in terms of declarative and procedural in brain terms. So, to the extent that he is occupied with what happens in the brain and not in the mind, we have no quarrel, because what we say about the mind might be realized in this particular way he describes in the brain. But the general distinction between declarative and procedural that also affects psychological accounts of language acquisition and processing, we would be able to translate into the terms of the MCF, but when we've translated them, they don't come out as different types of knowledge. So declarative knowledge is not different from procedural knowledge, but it's declarative knowledge that has those high resting levels that enables it to participate in thought. So it's really about the activation levels, So you can make the distinction, but it loses some of its rigid character. And of course, it's a term that's used about memory, but also about knowledge, and not for some people argue it's not quite the same. But there we are. Yeah.
Okay. And then I would like to ask you about some of the sociocognitive understandings of cognition. So in the field, there are certain claims that depend on sociocognitive perspectives. For example, Nick Ellis talks about the concept of distributed cognition, which you already addressed. So could this be accounted for or explained by the MCF? I think we've covered it pretty well, but do you have anything additional to say?
Yeah, we did in a way. If I make the distinction between knowledge in people's heads and knowledge out there, which is either stored or knowledge that has come to be shared between individuals, you can indeed talk about distributed cognition or extended cognition. But as long as you don't gloss over the rather crucial distinction between individual knowledge created through the physical signals and the results of that of interactions between people. And sometimes you do get the feeling that this is being glossed over, and I'm not accusing the people you mentioned, but in some discussions of it takes on a sort of pseudoscientific mystical nature, that it is our minds are sort of spread out into the outside world and are not separate. Well, they are completely separate in one sense, but the results of our interactions can certainly, you called stored knowledge. There's no problem about that. It's a kind of dangerous thing to talk about unless you're very specific about what you mean.
Yeah, I think it could be a misinterpretation of distributed cognition. That cognition just sort of flies away, but I think that's not what they're proposing. I think it's at a more informational kind of level, and also because it provides heuristics for the mind. So and I think that would bring us to mediation, which is from sociocultural theory. So in That's another socio-cognitive concept that's very important in our field, I think. And so would mediation be compatible with the MCF?
Well, yes. I mean, looking at the literature, some mediators are things that are states of mind, right? So that would interest us.
Oh, yeah.
Uh,
Mhm.
And other ones
Yeah.
refer to physical things like, you know, digital equipment and ways of influencing other people which originate in the outside world, those mediators, or technological mediators. But the mediators that are in people's heads, I don't think I have any problem with that because it can be accounted for by the MCF. It wouldn't be like a major sort of concept in the MCF, but it's you can borrow the MCF, as it were, to express what it would be in the MCF, particularly mediated to state of mind, because of course people communicate, individuals communicate, and some communication is very ineffective and other communication is very effective, and you have to kind of explain what makes communication effective. Actually, a long time ago, I used the concept of mediators when I was interested in language teaching, and trying to make explanations of time systems in English, you know, past time, future time. I used the concept of mediators, which I borrowed from a Russian psychologist who had fled the Soviet Union at the time and was temporarily stationed quite near me, and I got to know him quite well. Lev Lander. So I'm very familiar with the Vygotsky and all his work, which I find very interesting. Yes.
Very well. And I think in a way, of course, it's very dangerous to draw direct comparisons between theories because we may lose some nuance. But I think in a way, your idea of input enhancement could be perceived as a kind of mediation.
Yes, I think so. I think you're right. Yes. That's
But
precisely. No, I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Okay. And then and no, it's not the last question. So about processability theory. So MCF and the processability theory. A key concept in processability theory is processing prerequisites. So they propose 6 stages of grammatical development, where in each state grammatical mistakes are understood as alternative forms of an underlying system. So processing constraints are often an alternative explanation to universal grammar or to other explanations, and to why grammars have the shape they have as opposed to any other possible shape. So how much does the MCF rely on a universal grammar or language ability as opposed to these processing prerequisites?
Yes, it very much relies on some version of universal grammar, right? At the moment, we haven't chosen the mainstream one, but some version, yes. But the thing about Pieneman, you see, is that, well, initially he just wanted to apply a sort of general, what people understood as to be general psychological principles of processing to the business of explaining how some things are more complicated than others, and that the learner moves through stages where it gets increasingly more complicated, right? So in that sense, he's talking about processing constraints. But then later on, he found it useful to use the linguistic approach of a lexical functional grammar, which is actually a generative study. It does subscribe to the basic principles of generative theory, but is a different approach to how the grammar is structured. And he found this useful, but he uses it as a descriptive device to give content to the various stages that he has noticed. So, but he's never actually been directly interested in the notion of universal grammar. So even by using a disgenerative framework, he's not going to go into that, aspect of child language acquisition, as I understood. So his theory has developed a lot of, extra stuff. I mean, it's much more elaborated now, but it's still it's incorporated the generative theory that he's chosen, in a sense, as a descriptive device to explain the various stages. And when you talk about processing constraints, I think there's no one who actually claims there are no process. Even Chomsky has said, how we actually use the grammar has clear processing constraints. So it's not the case that there's a difference there. It's really setting it out. And also, his approach is a bit like Bill Van Patten's approach, in the sense that they're both been interested in processing, although Bill Van Patten subscribes more fully to the notion of universal grammar. They both have this idea that there are stages. Certain things are easier to acquire, and you can sort of predict how these things go, right? They have a slightly different approach to it. But I think that it's quite useful to compare those two approaches, because they have interesting similarities and interesting differences.
So the concept of input has evolved throughout the decades. So we've had, for example, Krashen's comprehension hypotheses, and then and later Bill Van Patten's input processing theory. So in principle, these theories would be more theoretically compatible, perhaps, with the MCF. But how do they really relate to the MCF right now?
When we talk about input, it's a very general term, right? So if we're talking about the physical input that hits your ears and your eyes, and that's a very limited way. Most people use input to describe how it begins to be processed, right? So as a language learner is being exposed to a language, some of the input has nothing to do with grammar or syntax or phonology at all. It has everything to do with meaning. So all the time you are processing the meaning, trying to get and make build a sort of meanings, not just from what you're hearing, but also from how you understand the context. So the process, the word input is a very general one, but most people mean language input. They mean the exposure to the language, and in the MCF, we think that the input is processed by different systems at the same time. So as your process, so as it were, it's a divide and rule system, right? So syntax only picks up things which are which it understands as useful to syntax. All the time we are understanding the meaning, not just through the language, but our understanding of the situation. And all these things are building up together, and then are forming, are contributing to a set of associations from all the different systems to get a combined notion of what's being said. And if your grammar isn't very good, you're going to build it a lot on your understanding of the context. If your grammar is very good, you're going to be able to do much better. So the notion of, actually, John Truscott has written quite an interesting introduction to how input has been is understood. Has come out recently. But yes, input is, again, like language, it's a vague term until you are very specific about what you mean and how it works.
You address complexity in your book, and you tell us that even though complex systems are present, we can still nonetheless see patterns. And I would also like to give some context to this question by the way in which someone like Phil Hyver presents complexity theory, or the importance of complexity. And he talks about the double pendulum. So one pendulum is quite predictable, just one point. As soon as another point is introduced, the whole system becomes very complex, very unpredictable. So I guess that your point is that yes, there is this chaos and this unpredictability, but it's constrained nonetheless. Would that be?
Yes. I mean, we are. Everyone agrees that we are pattern recognizers par excellence. We are created to look for patterns, right? And mathematically, you can show things have less or more predictability, but we're talking about how they are processed by the human mind, and the human mind is very much trying to make sense of everything and perceive patterns and represent these patterns as best it can. So and the end result of this, it has a sort of simplification effect, right? So as far the ebb and flow of language as it goes past you, nothing is predictable, everything happens slightly different each time, but we are looking for our minds have a principle of coherence, of homeostasis and coherence. We are driven to make a coherent sense of things, and anything that is not coherent simply doesn't get processed, right? But we try the best we can, although you might say the MCF mind is quite complicated when you put in all the details, it's basically simple, and much can be explained by the flexible nature in which all these systems can interact and respond to the millisecond changes in context. All of this can be coped with by a relatively simple system compared to the complexity of the outside world. I suppose chaos theory was designed to explain weather, right? Weather isn't cognition. Weather is very difficult to manage. But if you apply some kind of complexity theory to it, it's much better. You can make predictions of the weather using that. But talking about the human mind here in this totally different ballpark. It's not the same. So you don't have to have a highly complex, unpredictable system explanation to explain how the brain and how the mind makes sense of it.
Okay. I think that's a nice way to wrap up, because my first impression was scary. This complex monster, this graphs, things.
Yeah.
But in fact, it's meant to do the opposite. It's meant to explain in a simple way the function of the mind, which is quite complex. Thank you very much for
It was a pleasure.
with us.
Thank you.